All right. Hey there, folks. So I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar, where we're going to talk about what to focus on now for your company to take off post-pandemic. So my name is Robert Saint-Jacques, and I will be leading this webinar for today. So in terms of who you're going to be listening to today, so I myself am the GM of Professional Services here at 7 Geese. I have over 20 some years of experience in the HR field, and basically, in that time, I focused a lot of my efforts on performance management, and especially the cascading and communication and nurturing and nudging of strategy and getting it to flow through organizations. And another reason why I'm actually happy to be talking to you today is that because of my background and experience, going back to the early 90s actually, is that I've been through a lot of these downturns before and emergencies. So in my career, I've seen 3 economic downturns. I've been through a few hurricanes, which is a situation very similar to what we have today, in that all of a sudden you have a storm, boom, you've got no commerce, in many cases, no electricity for 2-3 months at a time. What do you do? So I've been part of businesses that have, powered through those type of situations and come out of it. I've also been in Africa when Ebola hit as well, and also in South Sudan in the middle of a civil war. So, what I'd like to do is, use my experience and background and being able to set context and share my experiences in terms of, how the organizations I was with, how we powered through, some of the situations we were in, and ended up not only surviving but thriving, post downturn, post hurricane, post Ebola, and so on. But more importantly, with me today we have a very special guest. So I'll let Chin go ahead and introduce himself, and I'll hand it over to Chin now.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name is Chin. Thank you again, Bob and 7 Geese, for having me on the webinar. My background, I think I hope to bring a lot of perspective and creativity to today's session. I come from more of a startup and entrepreneurship type of background, not so much in terms of experience around navigating this type of crises, but I've spent the last 5 years working with a lot of early stage entrepreneurs. I've probably worked with close to 500 companies in the last 5 years. Most of them are usually in survival mode. So I think the type of challenges that they come across are somewhat similar. They have to constantly listen to their customers, think about how they can pivot, brainstorm around revenue. So a lot of those ideas will come from me today.
All right, great stuff. And you can see, folks, right? So you've got, the hardened veteran, and then somebody who brings with him the experience, like you said, from that startup genre, right? But these are folks that have to live with dozens of constraints on them and power through, usually in cash limited circumstances. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Chin has to say on a lot of these areas. So in terms of what we're going to look at today, we're going to look at the state of work, focus, alignment, and clarity employees need, how to communicate these new priorities, right? Because it's one thing to come up with these great ideas and say, hey, let's do this, or we're going in this direction now, or we're pivoting and doing this. If you don't have a process, a structure, and the discipline to follow through on that, those great ideas may not come to fruition. And then the last piece is, once you have these great ideas, right, the how aspect, right? How to ensure, different people and teams are executing and ensuring accountability as well. And we'll also, give you time for some Q&A at the end as well. So in terms of the state of work today, right? So, if we're looking at this in terms of state of work, you have a situation where, folks are, especially in terms of performance management, how strategy is communicated, how work is done, right? You have, folks who have gone, back and forth. So companies, used to do the once a year appraisal. Clearly today, that once a year, goal setting with the end of the year appraisal is not going to cut it, right? You have some other folks that, have looked at, other options, and a lot of people are in between. So right now, I'm going to hand it over to May, who's from our marketing team, is helping us out today, and she will kick off a poll for you on the state of work today. So the quick poll question is, how comfortable are you with your company's current state of work? Give you a couple minutes to chime in your opinion. All right. So looks like the poll is all done. Okay, so thanks for your answers. So in terms of, as I alluded to in the beginning, in terms of traditional performance management versus continuous performance management, right? In the traditional sense, you had this once a year goal setting, and then everybody worked hard all year, and then you got evaluated at the end of the year. Then we brought in continuous feedback approaches where, some objectives and everything, the focus was more on projects, initiatives, and giving quick, bite-sized feedback, on initiatives that were constantly changing. And now, today, in terms of continuous performance management, right? So how we communicate what's going on, there's elements of goals, there's regular feedback, there's coaching, and there's some sort of review at the end to tie things up, right? And the other thing too that's interesting for the current state of work is the concept of recognition, right? Because we have live and in person, when we're all working together in the office, we have a lot of context communication. And you've all seen the studies which show, in terms of when we communicate, we use body language, we use tone, we use inflection, within the context to convey certain meanings. A lot of times, especially when you're working remotely now, you're losing a lot of that context communication. So overt recognition, very clear recognition for what people are doing is quite important, right? So then, how do we bring this to life, right? So what needs to change in a crisis? If we were before, moving along the continuous performance management, right? We're trying to coach, we're trying to set, smaller bite-sized goals. We were trying to do these things, but what needs to change now, right? We were already on that journey, we're doing well, and now all the rules have changed. So, start looking at this. It's interesting. If you're looking for, a tool or a process or concept, right? One area that we tend to, suggest to our customers and to other folks who've been contacting us lately is to, look at OKRs because, focus, alignment, discipline is key in these times. And this is OKR's home turf, right? So great quote there in terms of being able to use a very simple process, right? To help you touch on all those areas in terms of focus, alignment, and discipline. And so, when we start looking at these, right? So how are we communicating these new priorities to people in these areas, right? So it's one thing to state that, what's going to happen. Hey, this is, what's going to happen in the next month. This is what's going to happen in Q2, for example, if you're working on a calendar quarterly basis, right? But a couple things help out. First and foremost is one-on-ones, right? So continuous conversation with your employees, especially your teams. So this is from an organizational, division, department, sub-department, team level, right? And also on one-on-ones. There needs to be that follow-through communication. And before, before clients, start using our product, for example, they're saying, I ask managers, how often do you meet with employees? And they say, yeah, once a month. Yeah, I formally meet with employees half an hour once a month. That's good. Right? So you can imagine if that is the norm, with either when I'm doing seminars or, talking to folks that are interested in coming on to 7Geese, right? If this is the norm, it can't be the norm going forward, right? So one aspect is to start thinking about is how you increase your one-on-ones. The second one is recognition, which is what I just touched on. In terms of reinforcing, the positive, what I call positive deviance, positive behaviors of employees, and it makes it even more important remotely, right? Because people don't see what other people are doing. It's highlighting some of these efforts, and then you can use recognition to reinforce some of the organization's core values and how people are living it remotely. And then that provides, you're breadcrumbing a trail in terms of the behavior you expect. So that's fine. Okay, so once we communicate things, we've got to make sure we have one-on-ones. We've got to make sure we have, recognition. That's all great. But Bob, I signed up for this webinar to find out, what can we do? What are some of the things we can do? So usually the analogy that we use is, called, drawing back the bow, right? So like a bow and arrow, you're drawing it back. And when the crisis is over, you let go, right? But at this point, you're not stuck flat-footed. You're ready to release. You're ready to, take on the market. You're ready to get ahead of your competitors. So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, and we're going to get on into a little bit more and more detail. But starting from the top view, right? So if you look at it kind of like a funnel, right? In terms of the broader view, I'm going to turn it over to Chin. And he's going to give us a few ideas on how to position for the new normal. So go ahead, Chin.
Right, thank you, Bob. And probably quickly, I want to chime in on something that you said as well that I think is a small bit of gold in there. One of the interesting pieces in the OKR framework as well, for those of you who are familiar with it or not familiar with it, is that a lot of leaders, entrepreneurs, but also when it comes to employees, when it comes to getting them to come up with interesting solutions, we often find that a lot of us suffer from what we call shiny object syndrome. So we tend to come up with many, many interesting ideas for solving problems in different ways, but we want to make sure that they are aligned with the organization's objectives as well. So making sure that you use the OKR framework really helps with that. So I'm a big fan of that as well. Yeah, so maybe let's get to discussing a bit about some ideas around positioning. And I want this to be as engaging as possible. So if you guys have any questions at any time, do feel free to type out in chat, and I think May will convey the questions to us. But I want us to all remember first and foremost that when we think about the new normal, we're looking at a new normal on two fronts. So we have the new normal of, what's being impacted by this COVID situation. People are moving businesses online, behaviors are changing. So that's probably the key word there. Behaviors are changing. But what you want to see is you want to look at what behaviors will actually persist beyond some of this COVID situation thing. So once people go back to work in the regular environment, some things will still become habit for them because we've been locked up away for almost 2 months now, and they say it takes about 60 days for us to build a new habit. So you want to know what behaviors are changing in your customers. And not only that, as you look at the new normal, you're also looking beyond what's happening with the COVID situation, and you're thinking about what's being impacted beyond that. So you're seeing that a lot of people are being laid off. We are possibly moving into a recession, maybe even a depression. So what's going to happen beyond that? How is business going to be affected? How can you start to plan for that? So really the key here is when you think about positioning for the new normal, you want to do a lot of customer discovery. Now is the time for you to really go to your customers, try to understand what new patterns of behaviors they're building, try to understand what new challenges they're coming up with. So really interview them, get to know their new problems, get to know what's changing, and try to position yourself for that. Maybe you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So when we now understand better what our customers are going through, then the big challenge that usually a lot of startups come through, and I think some of the bigger companies, as you're starting to see that the marketplace is changing, is we need to start to think about how to pivot. And the first thing I want to remind all of us here is when we think about a pivot isn't usually a 180-degree change. It's not like you're going from drones to AR and VR. So when you do pivots can be small things, even as small as changing the language that you're using in marketing. So one great example is when I was working with Spring, one of the companies that we were working with, they had actually realized that their customer base, so they were actually selling baby products. So they recently noticed that their customer was not purchasing as much products as they used to. So they started to dig into that and try to understand like what's going on, why is sales not doing as well. And they realized that actually baby boomers were parents at the time when they started their company. So the marketing language, the copy was all really designed around baby boomers. And you see that, oh, now it's all millennials who are new parents now. So even marketing channels have to change, the messaging has to change. So even small things like that are also considered a pivot as well. So now you're seeing things like restaurants moving to doing takeouts, doing online delivery. Those small things are pivots as well. So when you think about the word pivot, it's not a big scary thing. I want you to really realize that it's really about catering to your customers what is changing. So yeah, the key when you think about a pivot is, I think in this situation, like change is one thing that has to happen, right? You have to remember, if you don't change, you will be forced to change regardless. So don't hold on too tightly to the current manifestation. When you think about a pivot, you're actually still delivering the same objectives for your company. Your end goal, your true north is still the same. It's just that you're taking a detour in terms of how you get to the end goal. So when you do a pivot, you're not actually changing your company, doing something completely different. So good pivots, if you think about like, how do I pivot? I'd say there are three things to look at.
Okay.
So when you consider a pivot, the first thing that you want to remember is your pivots should still be grounded in your company mission. The second thing is, now that it's grounded in your mission, you want to make sure that whatever pivots you decide to make are based on information that you actually have that is tangible. So what have you learned? And then the third is usually, in most cases, it does happen. There are outliers as well, but in most cases, pivots will usually happen around one of two things. So it will usually happen around the customer. So maybe you might say, okay, we are still serving the same customer, but their problems have changed. Therefore, maybe we will evolve our products, our service, our offerings. Or on the other hand, it might be that your solution is still the same, but you're pivoting your customer. So you're still solving for the same problem, but you're realizing that other people have this problem now because the environment has changed. So who are other customers, who are other targets, other markets that we can service as well. So just to give you some ideas around how to pivot.
That's great stuff, and it reminds me of a situation that my company found itself in. And it was funny, we were using OKRs, and we were mid-quarter, 6 weeks into the quarter, right? And the head of the organization, he calls in the leadership team and says, hey, guess what? Where are we on this live streaming of sports? And basically, at the time we were a video, OTT provider, so providing, TV shows and movies to a lot of countries in the developing world. And so, the head of the company came in and said, hey, where are we on this live stream of sports? And, the CTO looked at him and he said, well, yeah, 12 to 18 months away in terms of our roadmap. And the head of the company said, yeah, great. To your point, Chin, our largest customer has requested that we provide live streaming of sports. Okay, when? 6 weeks from now. So what we had to do was reorganize, right? So we had to focus, again, some of the benefits that were outlined, in terms of focus, alignment, and discipline. So what we had to do is refocus about 300 people in the organization out of about 700-800 at the time, and have them focus for 6 weeks on one set of tasks, right, that are related to being able to live stream sports for the organization. So it meets your criteria, right? Is it grounded in the company mission? Sure, because we wanted to change the way the developing world consumes content. Live streaming sports is also content as well, so that's great. Pivot is based on information. In this case, what we found was the customer had done a lot of that work for us and has said, people were demanding this. They wanted to watch football, they wanted to watch sports, cricket, whatever the case was, on their phones, their mobile phones. Great. Okay, so that works as well. And then in terms of, you said the third piece as well, in terms of customers, in terms of the situation for them, right? What they're trying to do is stay relevant and or beat out their competitors. In a very aggressively expanding marketplace, right? So they wanted to offer live streaming sports before anybody else did, through their own, mobile network. So it's interesting to see how, those three pieces came together, and how we were able to use the framework of OKRs, for example, to say, okay, here, instead of having 4 of these general organizational OKRs, which are very aspirational, we kind of dug down and focused a little bit more, right? And we're able to turn that around. Long story short, we were able to do it, and that led to significant amounts of revenue later on and expansion in customers. But, Chin, that was a great example because, again, what we did met the 3 criteria. And I hope some of you are kind of thinking, in your minds, hey, where are we in that area? What are those 3 criteria, right? Grounded in company mission, pivots based on information. And then lastly, it's either your customer, their problems have changed, or your customers themselves that, has expanded, or your solution could fit other folks. So thanks for that. So now, what we're going to do is look at a couple of, other areas, but, hand it over to Chin in a second. But, it's interesting when you look at the research, right? So let's go back to what Chin mentioned, right? If you're making decisions, they should be based on information. And, here, at 7 Geese, we tend to follow an evidence-based practice. So what does that mean? And basically, you should look at getting data from 4 sources, right? Your own personal experience, in terms of mine, 25 years, quite a few mistakes that I learned from my own, learned from other people's. You also have what your stakeholders want and need, right? So, it's about listening to your management team. Internal data, again, trying to get as much information as possible. And lastly, external research. And there's a massive gap, and I like to refer to it as the gap between what science knows and what business does. There's a tremendous amount of research that's been done in this area in terms of management, leadership, and so on. And unfortunately, it seems to be ignored, despite the fact that a lot of it's been fairly consistent. So it's not like, oh, well, there's a new leadership model last week and that works and nothing else works, right? You haven't heard those kind of comments before because it doesn't happen. A lot of the research, the slight changes are somewhat incremental. So when you're taking an evidence-based approach, right? I started looking back, and because I'm a big nerd and I read this kind of stuff, right? Which companies, were able to draw back the bow, so to speak, in 2008, 2009, 2010, maybe even to 2011, right? And then we're able to take advantage of the improvements in the economy and so on. And what they found is it's the team that focused on growth first. Now, we understand, right? We're not Pollyannas here, and we're not wide-eyed optimists. And oh yeah, we'll just go ahead and keep spending and everything will be fine. No, sometimes cuts have to be made, and we do understand that, especially in cases of cash flow. And every government, in terms of support all over the world, is a little bit different. But in terms of what the research shows is that those folks who invested in growth, and I mean that as broadly as possible, growth of their people, growth in markets, growth in channels, growth in R&D in certain areas, they tended to do much better than companies who just focused on just slashing cuts, cutbacks, especially deep cutbacks in people and R&D. So, now it's, you start to see the other way, right? So before, where you saw massive cuts, what are you seeing as headlines? CEOs and executives taking pay cuts first, right? Notice some of the big 4 doing this, some of the partners, the executive directors taking pay cuts, no increases, no bonuses and things like that in order to keep things going. So things, people have learned. So, in terms of this growth mentality, that's great for me to say, right? Research shows. But I'm going to hand it back over to Chin, right? And he'll walk us through, what does that mean, right? What does intelligent growth or evidence-based growth looks like, and how do we, kind of find those, those lovely nuggets, and how do we find gold within our own company, so to speak, our own organization? So back to you, Chin.
Great stuff. Quickly apologize if you hear some landscaping going outside. Anyways, on the growth side, I definitely agree. So growth, because obviously there's only so much you can cut at any given time, and there's a lot more potential for growth. But I do want to remind you all as well that you are the experts in your business. You should know your customers better than us. Like, whatever we give, make sure that you take our advice with your context and your situation, because growth might not be possible for every single company. So in certain cases, you might have to rely more on cuts to survive. So it really depends. On the cut side, just to quickly allude to that, making sure that when you do cut, that you don't actually cut in ways that will actually affect growth adversely. And then when you do decide to cut as well, when you're thinking about cutting as well, there are some obvious benefits for cut, because as you look at growth in certain ways, when you think about growth, there's usually cost that's associated with growth as well. There's a cost of service and goods, cost of acquiring customers, But when you're cutting whatever dollar you save, that's a dollar that you earn or a dollar that you save, a hard dollar, right? So there's no extra cost around it. So more on the growth side, maybe I'll talk on the revenue and sales side because that's kind of my background, and then Bob can chime in more on the team side. On the revenue side, so when you think about growth, the first thing that I want to bring to your attention is probably that the many businesses will probably notice that they apply or subscribe to the Pareto principle. So if you're not familiar with that, that's the 80-20 rule, where typically you can, if you look at sales or customers, usually about 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your biggest clients. So if that's the case, then when you come into this situation where there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the future, you just want to make sure that you kind of solidify your base so that if any one of those big clients pull out, that your business is not greatly affected by that. So then you can either go after more of those 20% type of big clients, so start to get your sales team to really go out, prospect those whales, or on the other hand, you can possibly open up to having more of those 80% clients that come and bring in smaller revenue. But what I do say on that front is usually a lot of companies say, but I don't really want to work with small clients because they can't afford our premium services, or they can't afford the typical rates that we give. So what I say to that is, sure, you can discount if you want to, but what you want to try to do then is you want to try to be able to share in the upside in some form. So you want to think about agreements where you can have some sort of revenue share, some sort of commission, maybe even equity, depending on how you provide your services to an organization. So that's where you can think about, okay, maybe now they're not doing too well, but when they do start to get better, when they start to grow, then we can all share in the upside together. So when it comes to thinking about revenue then, there's a great book. So Josh Kaufman actually has this book called The Personal MBA, and he talks about the 4 ways of growing revenue. And there's really only 4 ways. So I love the principles behind it. So I'm going to quickly go through some of it just to give you some ideas. So the 4 ways are increase number of customers, increase the price, obviously, increase the average purchase size, and lastly, increase the frequency of purchase. So they sound very conventional, but if you look at very many creative campaigns that different companies are doing, some of them, they might seem to go outside of these 4, but if you really analyze, it's actually one of these 4. So increasing number of customers, what can you do for that? So you want to start exploring different channels. You want to think about different ways to reach your customer. And this is probably going to be more relevant now because a lot of things are changing. Buying behavior is changing. People are moving online. So you're looking at different channels to reach your customers. You might also, because of the ability to move online as well, you might be able to reach different target markets. Or this might be a time to explore expanding to different regions as well. And then lastly, when you think about that, you can also think about different referral campaigns that you can build. So how can you leverage existing customers to get them to bring in more new customers? Increasing pricing, again, sounds very straightforward, but what you want to make sure that your team is aligned on is when you think about pricing, pricing increase will actually affect 2 things. So you want to look very closely and chart it against cost of acquisition and the lifetime value of your customer. Because typically as you increase the price, it's going to become more expensive for you to get customers, and they might stay around for a shorter time as well. So if you chart it out against a graph, you might see that, oh, at a certain point, it might get too expensive to acquire new customers, or they might start to leave too quickly. And you can try to help yourself find an optimal pricing as you take a more data-centric approach to actually mapping things out. And then the last 2 ones, if you think about increasing average order size, so you want to take advantage of things like upselling, cross-selling. So if you're not too familiar with the difference, upselling is you're selling a more expensive variant of the same thing. So for example, if someone's buying a TV, you might say, hey, instead of this 20-inch TV, why don't you look at this 30-inch TV? And then if you're looking at cross-selling, you're selling something that is different but related. So for example, if you're buying a bicycle, you might be selling someone, hey, you know what, you might need a helmet as well, you might need a water bottle, things like that. So upselling, cross-selling, bundling, looking at things like average order, discounts on minimum average order. So you might say, oh, if you purchase over $50, you get a small discount. So volume discounts, free shipping thresholds, things like that. And then lastly, when you think about increasing frequency of purchase, you want to explore different business models. So you're looking at how you can build more recurring revenue, more predictability around your income stream. So subscription models, loyalty programs, credits. The idea is kind of building a habit. And sometimes this might even require your business to take a fairly drastic approach to the types of services that you're providing. So in one case here in Vancouver, there's this company here called Push Operations. They started by doing accounting services for the hospitality industry. And in the process of doing that, they noticed that in accounting, it's something that happens once a year. So they're not usually top of mind for their clients. So they said, hey, how can we actually still speak to accounting in some way, but also be more top of mind, be more recurring for our clients? So they decided to address payroll. And by addressing payroll, it's a bi-weekly thing now. So the clients are more attuned to using their products, their services. And this makes it also harder for their clients to actually move away from them once they integrate more solutions into whatever they're providing. Maybe I'll stop there. Bob, any comments?
Yeah, just one piece, reminds me that this goes back now 25 years. So I was working with a law firm and I was in a location that got hit by a hurricane. And it was a devastating hurricane. Literally 80% of the telephone electrical poles were knocked down, 50% of homes were destroyed, most businesses were destroyed. So when you look at that kind of very bleak situation, right, you have no electricity, commerce is not going to return to the island for quite a while, and you're, commercial lawyer, right? So, I just thought, okay, this is going to be horrible. I'm going to have to move away, but there won't be flights, because there's all kinds of debris all over the airport and things like that. So a lot of things, were going through my mind. And this is when you see the importance of leadership, right? So you touched on it before, right? OKRs kind of being top down, bottom up. And, back then it was a law firm, right? So we didn't talk about OKRs, but we did see the leadership from, the managing partner. So she basically came in and said, hey, look, here's the situation. Here's what it costs to keep everybody on board. Here's the cash we have. Here's the cash we have access to. And, what would you like to do? And basically we just, by being that transparent, we as a team came up and said, okay, we'll take 50, 60, 70% pay cuts, depending on the individual. And if we do that for the next 3 months, we'll be able to use the cash or access the cash that we had. Now, the interesting piece, Chin, you raised this a couple of times, right? Customers. Our customers needed legal help, right? You had to file insurance claims, there's all kinds of issues related to government, bailouts and things like that, right? So working with FEMA, it was in the US at the time. And so there was a lot of work to be done. And so the rest of the firms cut employees, wouldn't service clients who couldn't pay them. We said, nope, we're not going to say no to anything. So we built up a massive amounts of accounts receivable. That allowed us to take, credit, use our line of credit against those accounts receivable. And, once the economy picked back up after 3 months, remember it's 3 months a lot of times. And thankfully, one of the places that did have a generator was the law office. So a lot of us were happy to be in air conditioning. But anyways, we worked our tails off. Those 3 months, just not saying no to customers, just saying yes and just saying, don't worry, pay us later. And that allowed us to keep going, to build up a massive accounts receivable, basically asset base, and we were able to, use our lines of credit. And then, of course, month 4 started drawing down, accounts receivable started coming back in, so that, the way it worked was we went like half pay, then we went to full pay, then we went to pay and a half, right, to come back. So, the cycle took 9 months. And then we got actually big bonuses because then all the accounts receivable started coming in for all the extra hours we put in. But again, it just comes down to leadership, clarity, right? Clarity of that goal, which is we are not saying no to clients. They are in need right now and they have the inability to pay. We know things will come back. We've had hurricanes before and focus through it, right? So again, it's to your point, right? What do your customers need? And are you in a situation and a lot of people pick on lawyers for not being very commercially minded. That wasn't the case, at the firm where I worked at, where she had calculated in her head, look, if I crank up my AR, accounts receivable, I'll be able to extend the line of credit and keep everybody in the firm on board, right? When things came back to normal, because we had built so much goodwill, right? So the psychological concept of reciprocity, customers came to us, their parent companies in the US, started asking us to do work. I was in the Caribbean island. They started asking us to do work on the mainland for them because of the goodwill we had built up and by not saying no. So it's a great point that you raise about, being hyper focused on your customers and delivering to them when you can, especially when others aren't as well.
Yeah, that's super smart. And to hone in on a concept behind that as well is, it is much easier and much cheaper to sell to an existing customer rather to acquire a new customer. So now is the time where if you can afford the marketing spend to actually bring on customers, maybe, again, remember your services are not free, you're just deferring payment, right? So they're coming in now, they're starting to work with you, and then now since they're already familiar with you, it's much easier for you at a future date to start to bill for them. Great.
Correct. And then it gives you a level of comfort, right? Because a lot of governments now, depending on which country you're in, if you're listening to this, there's different levels of support for businesses and small businesses, right? But, as a business owner, founder, or even a board, right, will have a lot more confidence going forward and saying, yeah, I'd like to borrow money because I know I'm, basically cranking up my receivables, going forward. And, again, there's a lot of, grant and loan money being made available to businesses. And so this is where, you can take advantage of that, but with a level of comfort that's saying, yeah, we'll be able to pay this back, because we're building it up to a certain extent. So now what I want to do is I want to get a little bit more specific, right? So we're talking about examples, but let's structure it, right? So we talk about, OKRs. Well, what does that mean, in terms of a structure? So, changes within a department, so talent acquisition, right? So, typically if you go in and you have your standard, Q2 departmental OKR, talent acquisition example, right? So we have this objective, right? Nice broad-based objective, aspirational, improve the candidate experience. And then we, key results, very quantitative, reduce time to hire by 20%, increase candidate satisfaction, increase, LinkedIn flows. Great, that's nice. But what do we do now? We're not recruiting, right? We've got a hiring freeze on. Oh no, what can a talent acquisition team do? Again, keep the same objective, right? So, as Chin mentioned, right? Stay grounded in your mission in terms of the mission of talent acquisition, right? It's about improving the candidate experience. But then the key results become a lot more focused, right? So, and a lot more precise. So in this case, contact X number of final but rejected candidates and conduct in-depth service of our process. Collate survey results by mid-May and complete and deliver top 5 priorities by June 30th in terms of process improvement. So you can see here, this is an example where you've taken this very broad-based OKR, yeah, let's improve the candidate experience. Everybody agrees to that, versus still the same objective, but it becomes hyper-focused and it becomes, you start doing things that are, will help you proverbially, like we started the section, draw back the bow, right? What you're saying is that you're preparing yourself with data and information, as Chin mentioned earlier. There's another area too, for example, engineering tech, right? So we had an objective, increase data security, reduce occurrences of data breach to 0. Again, all these things are lovely. Data recovery rates are increased, and 50% decrease in data migration, backup time. These are all wonderful, but if you're looking at certain areas, while you still may work on those, maybe now's the time to, again, draw back the bow. One of the bane, for a lot of startups and SaaS companies, for example, is tech debt, right? So everybody's got tech debt, right? People are busy being busy. But what that does is when you accumulate too much tech debt, right, it slows down your feature releases, because you got to keep in mind all these little tweaks you have to do. And, we've talked to a lot of organizations where these little tweaks are in the hundreds, okay? And so now would be probably a good time, again, if you're drawing back the bow, you're not releasing new features, because again, you cannot commercially take advantage of these, right? And your customers are kind of focused on just getting the basics right. So this would be the time. Again, hyper-focused, really narrow, very tight deadlines. Again, let's go back to, focus, alignment, and discipline, right? So we're focusing on tech debt. In terms of discipline, we are structured in what we're going to deliver, when we're going to deliver it, right? So you can see, like, internally within departments, right? But then, it becomes, well, okay, let's just say this has all been done. Let's just say we've had a lot of discipline, operating even in the good times. What else can we do? So I'd like to turn it over to, Chin and get his opinion on this area, but, I'm going to tell a story first. So, we've spoken to, many of our customers, and I said, okay, some of them are, our customers fall in 3 areas. One of them is they're growing. Actually, they're expanding because they're essential services. The second group has deferred revenue. In other words, the stuff they were supposed to do in February, March, April, May, June will have to happen, okay, because of the industry that they're in. So they're taking Q2 to really, really set up for, they may have worked 9 to 5, 5 days a week, but, starting in July, they're going to be working 24/7. And then the last group is the revenue that is just not there anymore, right? So they're in tourism or events and so on, right? So let's just say you're a concert promoter, you used to do 2 or 3 concerts a week. You can't do 20 concerts a week, right? In the last half of the year, there's just not enough people with interest and things like that to go around. So then they're looking for new sources of revenue. So one of our customers, I said, okay, what are you doing? And it's interesting, one of the folks who is in the deferred category, right? So they know they're going to be crazy busy when things pick back up again, has moved their salespeople over to customer support. Not as busy work, with very, very specific structure, right? And this is why they're a new customer, and this is why they were interested in OKRs, in that when they moved sales to customer support, it was, very specifically to sit in on a certain number of, customer calls. Then they had to develop case studies and user cases based on what they heard on those calls. And then further to that, they had to develop battle cards, for sales and so on in terms of the user case and user experiences that they managed to listen to. So it's not busy work. It's not just putting them in there. Again, that organization in that one case, right? Sales had pretty much ground to a halt, but they knew it's going to go crazy. So what did they do? They hyper focused, their sales folks, and said, look, this is what you're doing. We're moving you here, but here are the outcomes, the deliverables that need to come out of your experience with this. So I'd like to turn it over to Chin, who has a slightly different take on this.
Yeah, I mean, a quick comment before that. As you're seeing, like a lot of the goal setting is, so to speak, pivoting as well. And I might be preaching to the choir here, but when you think about adjusting your goals with your organization, there's a lot of merit to actually being transparent with some of the business challenges. And when you do that transparent approach, you also want to make sure that your employees are also very clear on what the business objectives are as well. Because what I see is a lot of goal setting usually comes from the top down. So they normally say, hey, these are our new objectives. I want you to change in this way, go and do it. Versus if you take a more bottoms up approach where you create a culture where employees can actually come up and bring up their own suggestions, as long as they have that clear line of sight on what the true north is, sometimes you can actually offload some of that burden. And actually, you might find that you actually get more creative responses, creative ideas as well, because your employees are the ones who are closer to your customers than you are in most cases. They're usually more attuned to customer needs, what's changing in the marketplace, things like that. So one great example is when we were working with a company that was raising capital. They weren't raising capital during a recession or anything like that, but they actually came into a situation where they were really, really tight on cash. They actually only had about 1 month of operational cash flow left. So they had to meet payroll the next month. And one of the things that they ended up doing at our advice was actually bringing up the situation with the employees. And instead of saying, hey, you know what, we have to lay off half of our employees, we'll just tell our employees this is the situation, and then we'll see what happens coming out of that. And what happened was a bunch of the employees voluntarily decided to actually take a pay cut so that no one had to be laid off. And then the ones who couldn't afford to take a pay cut, maybe because they had families, they were single parents, things like that, they actually banded together and came up with a new revenue plan, a new action plan. And what actually happened out of that was they actually doubled revenue the next month, and they went on to raise a series of capital, I think 1.8 million in the next 8 months. So, making sure that you're actually empowering your employees and, making that space for creativity as well. So that's a great way of doing it. And then maybe back to the sales to customer support. My perspective here is you want to be mindful about how you move salespeople around as well, because I want to caution against that, because in certain cases, you don't want to take the paddle off sales and marketing, because we talked about growth, and if you can grow and if you can continue to do sales and marketing, you still want to try and do that. But of course, in certain cases, it just might simply not be possible because revenue is different. There's no way for a customer to come in, but your salespeople, like Rob mentioned, they're not doing things that are totally unrelated to sales. Like when you are moving your salespeople somewhere else, they're still doing things so that when the situation changes, then they can actually be more empowered with more tools, case studies. They have a better understanding of the right language to use with their customers, so that these are people who are still going to be more effective as salespeople as well.
All right. So what about product management, right? So how do we make effective use of salespeople? Again, looking at that circumstance where for the time being, right, let's just say your typical deferred customer, non-essential services or new revenue areas, right? What would be the benefit of moving a salesperson to product management? How do we ensure that they get, the most value out of their time there, both for themselves, their team, and the organization?
Sorry, I was on mute. Not so much a repurposing example, but there's a local company here in Vancouver called Mobify. And one of the stories that I heard was that they actually moved their sales team to actually be located next to their product team. And by doing that, what you actually saw is salespeople were actually getting more knowledge around product, technical knowledge, but you also saw that the product team was actually learning very closely what salespeople were articulating when they actually try to convince customers about the product or services. This helped them really understand a priority of what features to build next, what features to add as new features. So just when you get salespeople who are close to the customers to bring that lens into the product development scope, then you actually get some very interesting ideas around, okay, what should we build? What's the priority? How should we go about doing that?
All right. So what about marketing, right? So, so sometimes in this area, okay, people are going through tough times, right? So marketing conducting in-depth data analysis. So, in this area, what I saw was a lot of this in many, right? So I was there in 2001 where we got the double whammy, right? So we had the dot-com bust, and then, we had 9/11 happening, one after another, and then 2008, 2009. And this is probably, it's interesting to read the research in terms of marketing becoming more what they call scientific, right? More data driven, because when things slow down, people need to become much more effective and efficient, in terms of targeting, right? So you saw a lot of the work, you saw a lot of interesting, a lot of startups, start in early 2000, 2001, 2002, and also, 2008, 2009, in terms of marketing analytics, marketing, data, and those areas, right? So, what I found was a lot of clients and say, okay, yeah, we've been doing a lot of A/B testing and things like that. Yes, we're already experimental, we're already data driven, but how much post-mortems go on, right? Have you looked for overall trending analysis, right? Especially recently, we've been on this growth spurt, right, for almost 11 years. How much time have you had to just breathe, look at the information that you have, and start looking for patterns, start looking for efficiencies? Chin mentioned earlier, right, in terms of the Pareto principle, looking at the 20% of customers that are 80% of your revenue. Who are those 20%? Right? How did you get them, right? So follow, whether you use HubSpot or some other CRM, right? Follow through where your leads came from, doing, those kind of analyses. And, it's fascinating to hear some of our customers just saying, yes, ad spend is down, we're not pushing more things out, we're doing more guerrilla, activities in terms of that are less expensive, but a lot more on the data side, right? And I've even heard one organization where they had their data science team working together with their marketing team. So like Chin mentioned earlier, with sales and product being co-located, what they did was co-locate remotely some of the data science and marketing teams, and having them work on some initiatives and some outcome related projects as well.
Yeah, and quick thing I'll say to that as well is you have to remember that data tells you what your customers are doing, but it doesn't tell you why they do it as well. So that, again, that's why it's so important to have everyone in your team actually conduct customer discovery to some level. So if your marketing people have some time on their hands as well, you want to get them to really ask the customers, speak to customers, try to understand the language that the customer is using, what's changing, things like that.
Okay. Now, there's also tactile businesses, right? So in-person to web transitions. And it's just been, for me, fascinating, especially the speed at which some folks changed. And they've come out of all kinds of places you wouldn't expect, right? So my wife is a yoga teacher, and she went and got yoga teacher training in Bali when we lived there. And that organization, I think by the end of February, early March, switched right away to online courses. And it's interesting, they kept the community aspect of it, right? So people usually go to yoga classes to feel part of a community. They did that as well. So they ensured that people were able to see other folks, right? Like on the Zoom, and so on, so that you can see, you get to feel part of that community down to, you see some of the larger, the big four organizations, for example, transition quite quickly to, how do we do audits, through web? How do we do analyses? How do we, and this is all of a sudden, I heard stories of IT audit folks talking to financial audit folks about becoming a little bit more technically orientated, so they can continue with some of the financial audits, but, sitting away from the customer, so to speak. So it's interesting to see how quickly, some organizations jumped in on that. Chin, do you have any other examples?
Yeah, and as we come to a wrap, just quickly want to remind you as well, when you look at this change from in-person to online, like it might be permanent for some businesses. You might notice that, oh, we've moved online and now things are actually doing a lot better and we're going to stay online coming out of this. But you have to be mindful of a few things. So one is there might be a rebound effect coming out of that. So people might crave more of the in-person after when we do get an opportunity to reconnect with people again. And then the second thing is there is the difference with the COVID situation and what might be a future recession coming up in the future as well. So the online might only be a small part of it, but when things go back to quote unquote normal, I mean, it's not going to be normal in the same sense that what was happening before, but if you can go back to in person, some things will still change as well. So what is changing? What do we need to keep? How are our customers actually reacting to that? So just keep that in mind and remember, not everything is going to be online forever. The question that we commonly get a lot is when companies move virtually, when they move online, or they start to adopt a lot of technology, is pricing. So when it comes to pricing, you have to remember at the end of the day, the most basic version of pricing is basically perception of fair exchange of value, right? So if you're moving online, it doesn't mean that you have to offer everything for free. So we're seeing that, yes, there is that expectation that a lot of things are now available online for free, but it really depends on your situation. So you want to look at, some questions to ask yourself. So is your customer segment changing or is it the same? So if your customer segment is the same and you're not able to change it by moving online, then technically you should not drop your prices. You should just be able to reframe value so that you can justify keeping the same price. On the other hand, if by moving online, that's allowed you to reach a larger market, or maybe that's brought down your cost of operations, then maybe you can be flexible with reducing prices or repositioning in different ways. But the idea is when you think about pricing, it's not always the case that you actually have to drop price, right? So, take a look at, value, demand, how is that changing? Are you exposed to more opportunities? What are business expenses? Are the things that you're doing still highly personalized, highly customized, or are you able to actually do more with the existing resources that you have just by moving online? So just give that some thought when you think about pricing.
Yeah, and also there are some fantastic tools, so even, when people said, okay, so, education, training in those areas, right? And you can imagine there's a massive retooling going on with teachers having to learn, transition from in-person to online. But you raised a great point there. I talked to my son, as well, and I said, what are your friends saying? And they said, they want to go back into the classroom, because they find the transition a little bit clunky. So to your point, right? They're actually looking forward to in-person classrooms again, despite my son and his friends being quite tech orientated, and they go to Code Academy. They do a lot of online learning. It's not that like they're Luddites, and it's not that they're anti-tech. It's just, they like a personal balance of the two, so to speak, to go back and forth. All right, so we're coming up, towards the end of the hour here. So in terms of the key takeaways, right? So what we're looking at is, we talked about focus, alignment, and discipline. And in terms of focus, work on 3 or 4 priorities, right? People, revenue, customers, process. How can you improve those while you're going through this? And typically companies do focus on many things. They maybe have 6, 7, 8 things that they'll work on throughout the year. But in this quarter, Q2, it's about focusing on 3 to 4 priorities, again, on the growth aspect of it. Alignment, we talked about the need to communicate more often, one-on-ones, recognition, and then, discipline. commitments matter now more than ever. Remember, we're in an era of uncertainty. So if you make a commitment to do a weekly one-on-one with your employees, if you're a frontline person, you make a commitment to get certain things done. Remember, the organization is counting on you, and it's in this situation, it's become even more critical given that there's very little extra slack, so to speak, into the system. In terms of drawing back the bow, we talked about examples in terms of how to prepare your organization for when things come back to normal, right? What do you need to do inside? Well, so what does that mean? So internal team changes, right? So not changing the team themselves, but we gave the example of engineering and recruitment, where the focus shifts a little bit in terms of improving processes. We talked about moving peoples and teams around inside the organization, and we talked about moving people and teams outside the building, so to speak, into into the web sphere. So now, with the last couple of minutes, we've got a final poll, which is up. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention and for signing on today. And I'd also like to thank Chin very much for providing us with his views and his advice, especially since, he's helped hundreds of, startups and, develop and go through. I think, this is really important because, again, most early stage startups are working with a serious amount of constraints, and they've innovated or, use some creativity to ensure that they are able to continue growing and continue to exist in many cases. And some of his points are really, really important to keep in mind right now.
Great, thanks for having me.
All right, well, that is the end of the webinar today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if anyone has questions or wants to connect, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, same here. So I'm Robert Saint-Jacques on LinkedIn, and Chin?
Just Chin Heng Chang.
Okay,
yeah.
On LinkedIn, there you go. Don't hesitate, not only LinkedIn. If you have any questions, go ahead, I'm open. Most of the folks after these kind of situations in webinars have some questions, know that I do answer them. So go ahead, and if you have any offline questions, be happy to either start a discussion or answer your questions privately.